You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
I'm Keith Luce with the National Committee on North Korea. On behalf of NCNK and the East-West Center, we are pleased that you've joined us for today's program on North Korea-Europe relations. Today's webinar is the first in a new East-West Center and NCNK series intended to inform about North Korea's global connectivity. Over the years, official Washington has turned to sanctions targeting North Korea as the primary policy emphasis in responding to North Korean behavior viewed as provocative and dangerous. A prevailing thought has been that sanctions would alter North Korea's behavior, given the assumption that it is an isolated and hermit kingdom. Well, the opposite reality has prevailed. Among other points, North Korea's nuclear and WMD programs are thriving. It has also accelerated its massive and complex cyber intrusive activities, resulting in significant income for the country. The North Korea in the World website, co-hosted by the East-West Center and NCNK, illustrates North Korea's worldwide connections, and by existence of the website, it's an encouragement to policymakers and to the public to consider a range of options related to North Korea. North Korea's interaction with Europe is significant. In fact, as we meet, North Korean diplomats are continuing or accelerating their interaction with European counterparts, while the North Korean government is refusing to engage with the United States government. There are a number of European countries which engage with the North Koreans and concurrently maintain positive diplomatic relations with the United States. For example, Sweden, which maintains an embassy in Pyongyang, serves as the protector of US interests in North Korea. However, this is enough from me. I'm pleased now to turn the program over to my East-West Center colleague, Ross Tokola. He is the executive associate to the director at the East-West Center in Washington, where he gives advice and support on ongoing near-term and long-term strategic projects and programs. He is also responsible for East-West Center congressional staff programs and Korea-related projects. Previously, Mr. Tokola was a program officer at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies during his 5 years in Seoul, and he worked for the US embassies, both in the Republic of Korea and in the United Kingdom. In addition to studying the Korean language at Sogang University in Seoul, he holds a BA and MA in philosophy from Haythrop College, University of London, and a master's in philosophy in international relations from the University of Cambridge. Ross, over to you.
Keith, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be working with NCNK in collaboration on this project, on this webinar series, and of course on the website. So thank you very much. And now I'll give a brief introduction for both of our speakers. First off, we have Dr. Ramon Pacheco-Pardo. He is a professor of international relations at King's College London and the KFVUB Korea Chair at the Brussels School of Governance at La Universiteit Bruxelles. Professor Pacheco-Pardo is also an adjunct fellow, non-resident, with the Korea Chair at CSIS, a non-resident fellow with Sejong Institute, and a committee member at CSCAP EU. He has held visiting positions at Korea University, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and Melbourne University. His publications include the books Shrimp to Whale, South Korea from the Forgotten War to K-pop, as well as North Korea-US Relations from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. Professor Pacheco-Pardo has been the editor of Millennium, Journal of International Studies, and currently sits on the editorial boards of East Asia, an International Quarterly, EU-China Observer, and Global Studies Journal. He has participated in track 1.5 and 2 dialogues with South Korea, North Korea, China, and Japan. Professor Pacheco-Pardo has testified before the European Parliament and advised the OECD, the European External Action Service, the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the United Kingdom's Cabinet and Foreign and Commonwealth offices. He's also a frequent media commentator on Northeast Asian affairs and EU-East Asia relations. I'll just also add that Ramon collaborated with the East-West Center on a publication called Korea Matters for Europe, Europe Matters for Korea, which presents the dynamic relationship between the Republic of Korea and Europe. So Ramon, thank you very much for joining us. And before we go into our conversation, I would also like to introduce Dr. Teresa Nabotna, our second speaker. Dr. Teresa Nabotna is a Korea Europe Center Fellow at Free University Berlin and a Korea Associate at 9-Line. She previously held a Korea Foundation and Marie Curie Fellowship focusing on research projects on the EU and South Korean approaches to the COVID-19 pandemic and on the EU's foreign policy towards North Korea at the Center for European Integration at Free University Berlin. She's also a Senior Associate Research Fellow at the European, which is a Prague-based think tank, which is focused on EU policies. From 2017 to 2018, Teresa was a Korea Foundation visiting professor at Seoul National University and Fudan Fellow at Fudan University in Shanghai. She collaborates with the Institute for European Studies, Université Libre de Bruxelles, where she held 2 postdocs from 2012 to 2017. Teresa received her doctorate from Boston University in 2012 and other degrees from Charles University Prague. She is the author of the monograph, How Germany Unified and the EU Enlarged, Negotiating the Accession Through Transplantation and Adaptation. And she has widely published on EU foreign policy in, among others, Journal of Common Market Studies, Studia Diplomatica, and on EU Northeast Asia Relations in 38 North, The Diplomat, The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, 9-Line, Asia Trends, and others. Teresa has been a frequent commentator for media outlets such as Indus News, Czech TV, and NK News. So Teresa, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to our audience as well for tuning in. What we have here is a real wealth of experience and knowledge. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you both here as our guest speakers. First off, let's begin with Ramon. So Ramon, could you start us off by providing a broad overview of European relations with North Korea?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be working with you again. I would say that currently, of course, because of the pandemic, relations with North Korea have weakened significantly. Of course, the embassies, for example, in Pyongyang, well, the ambassadors or the workers in the embassies, they actually had to leave the country. There have been some meetings online, for example, between the European Parliament and North Korean diplomats in Berlin, but there have been no face-to-face meetings. So, of course, since the beginning of the pandemic, and North Korea being the first country that closed down its borders, relations have been put on hold. Now, before then, if we go back to the early 2000s, when a bunch of European countries, the European Union, Western European countries, the European Union, established diplomatic relations with North Korea, we thought back then that there would be a period of engagement, a period of strengthening relations between the EU and North Korea, and Europe and North Korea, European countries as well. But of course, we saw the start of the second nuclear crisis. And since then, the European Union, with the support of all EU member states, but even countries that are not part of the European Union, follow a similar approach, established this so-called critical engagement policy, which essentially means that the European Union, European countries are going to mix carrots and sticks, carrots such as dialogue, for example. The EU used to have a political dialogue with North Korea, a human rights dialogue as well. Of course, there were the embassies in Pyongyang I mentioned, and North Korean embassies across different European countries, the potential of economic support if North Korea changes behavior, some aid as well, but also sticks in the form of the imposition of sanctions on North Korea, including autonomous sanctions from the European Union, based on the belief that UN sanctions are not enough to change the behavior of North Korea. And what we saw over time is that this approach, sanctions, took hold and became, in my view, the dominant policy that the EU and European countries have been following towards North Korea. In recent years, not only sanctions related to a nuclear program, but also sanctions related, for example, to the cyber activities coming out of North Korea, to human rights abuses. In North Korea, we saw how the political dialogue stopped as well in the mid-2010s, so even before the pandemic. And what we saw in recent years, even during 2018-19, when we saw this rapprochement between the two Koreas, and we saw the two or three summits or meetings between President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, we saw how in my view, the EU and the European countries didn't really change their position much. There was a skepticism towards what many thought was a change in behavior from North Korea across Europe. And in my view, was so limited support for this rapprochement. And of course, once North Korea restarted its missile tests and later on closed down because of COVID, I think many European policymakers, both from the EU, from member states, other European countries outside of the EU, they felt vindicated and said, well, we told you so, North Korea hasn't changed its behavior. And therefore, I think where we are now is in an impasse to see what happens when North Korea opens up. But I would assume that Europe would continue this wait-and-see approach, would wait for South Korea, for the US to take the lead, and try to take it from there. Last point, though, that in spite of, in my view, this more assertive approach from the European Union, focusing more on sticks rather than, as I said, carrots, there has always been political support for the position that South Korea may take. This happened under President Moon and the President Park, whatever the position that South Korea takes, in theory, the EU and European countries support it, and this is actually part of the policy. So this means that if we have a president now, President Yoon, for example, some people say he might become more assertive towards North Korea. The European will provide, and Europe will provide this political support in the same way that in theory, it was providing this diplomatic political support to the previous engagement policy pursued by former President Moon.
Ramon, thank you very much for that overview. And now I'd like to ask Teresa, maybe could you just describe or assess the difference between EU collective policy towards North Korea and that of individual European countries? Now the EU tries to strike that balance.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Rose, and thank you, Keith, for inviting me to this talk, first of all. And it's a really great pleasure to be here, at least virtually, although I'm in a small town in Bavaria at a different conference, actually. So it's a very nice place to reflect about EU North Korea policies. I would just basically echo everything what Ramon said in terms of the EU's approach, the critical engagement, which nevertheless in the last few years has been much more critical than engaging. And I've always been very disappointed by that approach, or by the fact that the EU doesn't try to engage a little bit more than it should or it could. But as you actually ask, it is partly down to the difference between the EU policies and the member state policies, because when it comes to EU foreign policy, we still have unanimity rule within the EU. So to some extent, you can't have a policy which wouldn't satisfy all the member states. And given the international situation, also the fact that North Korea has been launching all sorts of tests, it looks like that basically sanctioning North Korea is something which everyone can agree on. Until quite recently, the PRK was, the most sanctioned, or the EU always said that it has been the most sanctioned country in the world. Of course, now with Russian invasion of Ukraine, the PRK sort of lost this privilege, and Russia is nowadays the most sanctioned country by the EU. But you asked about the different member states. So I think we have quite a wide range of views. On one hand, we have sort of the more hardline countries. It used to be UK while it was still member of the EU, but it's definitely France, which is probably leading the hardline club. But it's also Germany. On the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum of those countries which tend to be more pro-engagement and more willing to, for instance, also provide humanitarian aid, is Sweden or Finland as well. These countries also have been quite good at providing venues for 1.5 or two-track, or rather two-track dialogues. And then you have countries in the middle, quite often countries from Central and Eastern Europe, where I come from, for instance, the Czech Republic, they have the position somewhere between. So they are still willing to engage, but rather below the radar. So publicly they support the hardline position. So I would say this is sort of the broad overview of the member states. And as Ramon said, I think we are not going to see such a huge change in this respect anytime soon. And maybe one point, since we are talking probably primarily to the American audience, just one anecdote. I remember talking to Heiko Maas, the former German foreign minister, maybe 2 years ago, and I asked him, why is Germany so hardline, given the fact it has an experience of being divided and engagement between West Germany and East Germany? And he basically said, well, don't tell anyone, but that's the only thing we can agree on with the Americans. That was still while Donald Trump was the president. So in a way, also this fact to kind of be on the same side as the United States is in its policy towards the DPRK. I think that's also one of the motivations why both the EU and certain member states have the position they have.
Thank you very much. I'll remind our audience, if you wish to ask questions, please do so in the Q&A or the chat functions. I'll ask some more questions, then turn to those as they come in. But I want to go a bit more into what you've both discussed a little bit already, that there have been changes in European member countries' attitudes towards North Korea over time. Could you describe some of those instances from the early days of European member countries forming relations with North Korea, and what that has looked like over the decades? I think I'll turn to Ramon first, and then Teresa.
Yeah, sure. So I think that there's mentioned something important, right? There are different views across Europe, right? We do have a common EU policy. It is agreed by all member states, and as Teresa said, right, countries such as the UK, for example, has left the European Union, similar approach, right? But it's true that there are differences, and obviously there is a different history. Central Eastern European countries have far longer history of relations with North Korea, because they used to be part, of course, of the same communist camp in the past. Western Europe is very different, but even within what we probably understand as Western Europe, if you go countries such as Sweden, for example, that was mentioned by Teresa, already in the 1970s was trying to have a neutral position, right, and try to maintain some links with North Korea. Countries such as Ireland as well have a longer history of doing so. If we focus more on the past 2 decades, and I think the past 2 decades are important because it was in the late 1990s, early 2000s when we saw the period of engagement between Western European countries and North Korea. They established diplomatic relations. This was, of course, around the time of the first Inter-Korean Summit, when we thought that there was going to be a different relationship between the two Koreas, and obviously a different North Korea. And it was also about after the Great Famine that North Korea suffered, and European countries wanted to provide economic support to North Korea. Right in the early 2000s is when you start seeing European countries, some European countries opening embassies in Pyongyang, or reopening embassies, right, or increasing the number of staff. If you're talking about Central Eastern European countries, we see, for example, the UK opening its embassy in Pyongyang, Germany, unified Germany, opening its embassy in Pyongyang as well. So you see these very big European countries central to European Union foreign policy, taking a different approach. And I think during this period of time, there was a real hope in Europe. You saw EU delegations visiting Pyongyang. There was a real hope that there was going to be a change in North Korea. And even during the earliest stages of the second nuclear crisis, there were countries saying, well, there is a dialogue going on with the Bush administration. This may mean that North Korea is genuine, not necessarily about denuclearization. They have, of course, different views of whether North Korea wants to denuclearize or not, but at the very least, opening economically, having a different sort of attitude towards the outside world, including the US, but including also, of course, South Korea, maybe even Japan as well. And there was this hope. And I think what happened is that you saw many Europeans engaging with North Korea at the government level, at the civil society level, many track 1.5s are taking place. And I think eventually there was a period of, we reached a point of disappointment. There was a point of disappointment that North Korea was not changing, kept testing nuclear weapons. It wasn't really implementing the economic reform that we have seen in places such as Vietnam or China that often are taken as potential models for North Korea. And you did see many policymakers thinking, what's the point of engaging with North Korea? And I think the point that Teresa mentioned was very important. During the Trump administration, it is true, it was one of the very few issues in which Europeans and Americans could agree in terms of foreign policy. But I would say even before then, right, when we saw the Obama administration taking this approach whereby there wasn't real diplomacy going on with North Korea, right? This strategic patience, whichever way you want to call it. Many Europeans also became disillusioned, right? Because we have seen during the six-party talks, there had been talks with North Korea and this multilateral framework. Of course, the European Union and Europe had been excluded from the six-party talks, but in spite of that, there was a hope that if there is an agreement being implemented with North Korea, Europe can contribute. But during the Obama years, we saw that this was not happening. There was no engagement taking place. During Trump, it is fair to say that many Europeans felt that it wasn't proper diplomacy, what the President Trump was doing. They didn't think that it was going to go anywhere, so there was a skepticism from the beginning. Some European countries did welcome a little bit more the approach by President Moon. They thought, well, this is better thought of, definitely, that President Trump is doing. But still, the feeling was, even if we go back to the six-party talks years, what has happened since then? Well, not really much. North Korea has continued with the nuclear weapons program, ICBM program. It is proliferating, that we should mention. In Europe, there is a big concern about North Korean proliferation to the Middle East. Countries such as Iran, for example, acquiring technology or expertise at the very least from North Korea, and this is seen as a threat, direct threat to Europe, right? To the European continent, in the same way that many Europeans feel, well, there is not going to be a strike from North Korea into European territory, right? I'm talking missile strike, right? And not about the cyber attacks that are actually happening, of course. But there was this concern that, if Iran developed its own nuclear weapons program, what's going to happen in the Middle East and the greater Middle East? This is a direct threat to Europe. And then in more recent years, I think the reason why more Europeans turn against engagement with North Korea, with the exception of some of the countries that Teresa mentioned, that's very true. I mean, like countries such as Sweden and Finland, that should be commended because they continue to engage with North Korea, at the very least to understand North Korea, which I think is positive. And Teresa's own country, Czech Republic, Poland, I mean, they do engage with North Korea. And I personally, as I said, I think it's positive. But it is true that when the European Union came up with its own human rights sanctions regime and cyber sanctions regime, you saw the first countries sanctions were North Korea, China, and Russia. There is this perception these three countries are the same. This started before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but now, of course, this has been multiplied even further, right? This idea that you have these three countries that are undermining the liberal international order, not only that, are launching cyber attacks, they don't respect the human rights of their own population, right? So what is the point of engaging with them? Having said that, in my view, if in the future, let's say 5-10 years time, we're in a different position, there is engagement between the US and North Korea, between the two Koreas, and this seems to be going somewhere, I think the position from Europe will change, because I don't think there's a strong lobby in Europe against engagement with North Korea. There is maybe a lack of interest right now, or focusing on other foreign policy matters, but I wouldn't see European countries trying to prevent, for example, this is very hypothetical, but the UN Security Council removing sanctions on North Korea that was discussed in 2018-19, right? Is this potentially going to happen? I don't see France or the UK actually blocking this, right? I think they would go with the flow and they would provide the necessary support. And this has been discussed internally in Europe, that Europe would be ready to provide support if there is a proper diplomatic and engagement process with North Korea that seems to be leading, at the very least, to controlling the North Korean nuclear weapons program and proliferation activities.
Thank you. Teresa.
Yes, there's a hard to what to add to Ramon's very comprehensive answer. I think he's quite right. I think I was hoping that now with Europe's bit bigger focus on the Indo-Pacific, perhaps before the war in Ukraine broke out, that there would be also a bit more focus on the Korean Peninsula and especially on North Korea. So far, doesn't look like that things are evolving in this case. There is definitely more interest in working with South Korea, but possibly on other issues than DPRK. And if President Yoon is a bit more on the assertive side of things, I think it's gonna only just reinforce the European approach that we should just basically stick to the easy policy, the easy side of the policy, and that's continuing with sanctions. Yes, I think this is where we are at the moment. There was also some hope that within the European External Action Service, which is sort of the EU's diplomatic arm, that there could be some kind of a review of EU policy towards North Korea. I don't have any internal information where it is headed, but I have a feeling that it's been sort of, a bit frozen or perhaps overtaken by other things. And it doesn't look like that there would be much of an impetus from this side either. Of course, it's possible that North Korea will kind of try to attract our attention by things it has been doing. But again, if it's, for instance, another nuclear test, which we may possibly see at some point, that's obviously not going to encourage more efforts for engagement, but rather the opposite. When it comes to current issues, we could also talk a little bit about the COVID situation, which maybe brought North Korea a little bit to the attention from slightly different perspective than just the ballistic missiles and testing them and so on. But also, I think, given the fact that they've been not very, from my perspective, they've been a bit creative when it comes to reporting numbers of COVID cases, and the situation which has developed, it doesn't seem to lead to the willingness of the North Korean government to engage with the international community, at least when it comes to fighting COVID. So, for instance, accepting vaccines. I think this is not going to be a window of opportunity either, which I find that it's a bit of a shame. But yeah, I think this is where we are at the moment.
Teresa, thank you. Could I ask you to describe a bit more about what European member countries and EU humanitarian aid to North Korea has looked like over the years?
Yes, I mean, that's one thing I maybe should have mentioned at the very beginning, that actually, despite the EU being more critical than engaging, it has been largest donor, largest provider of humanitarian aid. I mean, the humanitarian aid peaked, or the highest aid was around 2010, 2011. Again, around 2014, there was another spike, and unfortunately, since then, the numbers have been going down. Of course, nowadays, since DPRK closed off its borders, as Ramon mentioned, as the first country in the world, a day before China actually closed down Wuhan, then that prevented most of the humanitarian aid, which would be ready to come in. And of course, also the fact that anyone who wants to engage on this side of things also has to go through, humanitarian exemptions process. But nevertheless, still, the EU is the largest provider. It mainly focuses on food and food security and health as well. But it's in terms of numbers, the EU as such is the largest donor, but you also have the member states in addition to that. And Sweden is the #1 among the member states, and Germany is the #2. So yes, Germany, at least on this issue, is keeping bigger profile than other member states. But we also have some member states which even don't have bilateral diplomatic relations with the DPRK, so that also affects the entire situation. But again, going back to what impact the COVID and the closed borders may have, that's potentially quite strong deterioration of the humanitarian situation on the ground, malnutrition and so on. So this is where Europeans could step in without actually changing the policies of putting sanctions on the DPRK because of the nuclear issues.
Ramon, thank you very much. Ramon, would you like to comment on this question or anything that Teresa has raised?
No, I just want to add that the last point is crucial, the provision of humanitarian aid. I think the EU, many member states, other European countries, they do feel that they should be separate from the sanctions that may be imposed on North Korea. It's interesting to talk to the embassies on the ground, for example, or to talk to the NGOs providing the aid, because they are very clear that they do reach their intended recipients, because there's always this discussion, is this actually going to the regime as opposed to ordinary North Koreans? I say, well, no, actually, we do have access to North Koreans. It's not that we give it to someone in Pyongyang and they distribute the aid, right? It doesn't work that way. Until the pandemic, they had people on the ground. And I think it's crucial, and it goes to the previous point that, if at some point there is really different relationship with North Korea, that's why I'm quite positive that Europe would really engage. I mean, there has been many discussions. There were many discussions 2018-19. If there is an agreement with North Korea, and for example, there's going to be a rebuilding of infrastructure in the country, what can Europe do? And there were firms that say, well, we'd be interested in exploring the possibility of looking into this. Some governments saying we could provide economic support for these sort of initiatives, or even if it's to improving the agricultural sector in North Korea, for example, that it is done through European aid, but obviously not to the extent that North Korea needs. So that's why I'm positive that this would happen if there is a different relationship with North Korea, because there is goodwill, not to the regime, obviously, but to the North Korean population. And also I have to say, Teresa mentioned a very important point, the relationship with South Korea, which is crucial for the European these days. I mean, if you look at the Indo-Pacific or Asia, really is South Korea, Japan really are top of the list in terms of countries that are like-minded, that you want to work with, that you have no problems with, and that you want to strengthen relations with, right? So if at some point South Korea has a different relationship with North Korea, there would be this goodwill that is being generated by cooperation in other areas. That I agree with Teresa. I mean, there are other areas that are more important from a European perspective now when it comes to working with South Korea. But obviously there would be this goodwill that is being built as we speak, really, with previous administrations, and I think with the current one as well.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to some of the questions coming in from the audience. First off, from Mark Tokola. He has asked, has the EU raised the issue of North Korea's sanctions violations with China? Speaking of the wider Indo-Pacific dimension. Maybe to Teresa first?
Yes, well, the EU has definitely been quite active in terms of demarching third countries to actually implement the sanctions that they agreed to. So obviously China is among them. I don't think it's, there was a EU-China summit on 1st of April, I believe. I don't think this came up as, key point of the discussions. The key point between Europe and China at the moment is potential support between China and Russia in terms of Ukraine. So obviously North Korea has slipped down the agenda quite a bit, but yes, EU has been quite active in trying to persuade countries to implement the sanctions. One thing which I always thought the EU could also do a little bit more than it has been doing, if it was doing it at all, and that's to press China on the North Korean refugees, which can go from the DPRK through China to possibly, other countries. And if they are basically caught by the Chinese authorities, they are automatically sent back to North Korea. And of course, EU has always been very keen on non-refoulement policies, that is, not to send back refugees to countries where they can face punishment or persecution. So in a way, what Europe could also do is to press China on, changing its stance on North Korean refugees and consider them actually as refugees and not as economic migrants, and not to, send them back, basically. But I don't think that this has been really taken up by European countries. But yes, in terms of sanctions, EU has been pressing China and other third countries to implement the sanctions.
Thank you. Ramon would like to speak to this issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, Teresa summarized it. It has raised it. Liu Xiaoming, the Chinese envoy for North Korea, was in Brussels recently. This was raised. Yes, it's been raised constantly, and I would like to emphasize what Teresa says, that when it comes to demarches to different countries across the world to emphasize the importance of sanctions, that's something that the EU has been doing for many years, and I think the EU considers that this is part of its role, part of the role that it has to play when it comes to dealing with North Korea. And obviously this includes discussing it with China, absolutely.
Thank you. Speaking of France earlier you mentioned, Teresa, that France has a hardline position among European Union member countries. And you've also mentioned that France does not officially have diplomatic relations with North Korea. I believe neither does Estonia. So a question from the audience, Satu Miyamoto asks, why didn't France sign diplomatic relations with North Korea while the EU did? And could you also speak to Estonia not having relations formally with North Korea and what this relationship looks like?
Yes. So actually, there are two issues. I'm not an international relations lawyer, so forgive me if I'm not 100% correct. But there are actually two issues at play. So one is diplomatic relations, and the other is recognition of a third country. And in case of France, France actually does not recognize DPRK as a sovereign state, which I've always found a bit strange policy, in a sense that this is used for countries, or, for instance, France doesn't recognize Donetsk and Luhansk republics as independent states because obviously they are part of Ukraine, South Ossetia and things like that. But I don't think, question of recognizing DPRK as a sovereign state, no matter if we like it or not, or we agree with the policies they pursue, I don't think that should be really a question. Nevertheless, this is French position. But then you also have diplomatic relations, and this is, I think, where Estonia comes in play. So Estonia does recognize DPRK as a state, but it does not have diplomatic relations with DPRK. And that's slightly a different issue. So kind of, second tier level or second tier in diplomatic relations between the states. The French position affects things like, for instance, the fact that there is officially no DPRK embassy to the EU in Brussels, because you cannot have that unless you have all member states having recognized the state. Actually, number 2 in Berlin, because DPRK has an embassy in Berlin, is unofficially in charge of the relations with the EU. I mean, of course, we can say, once the DPRK starts behaving properly, we can, give it as a reward. That's possible, reward for good behavior. But at the same time, we allow we allow Russia to have embassy, we allow, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, we allow, all sorts of countries which have, quite questionable track record on, for example, human rights to have representations. So I don't think from that perspective, this is a very productive policy. And if I could encourage French government to change its stance, at least in terms of recognition, it doesn't have to have the diplomatic relations, but at least to recognize DPRK, then I would definitely do it. But yeah, I'm not, I don't think the French government will change this stance anytime soon, because basically it considers this step as a reward or as one, if DPRK moves, for instance, towards the nuclearization, it could be one of the rewards for that. But at the same time, I don't think DPRK will denuclearize just because it wants to be recognized by France. So I find it a bit counterproductive.
Thank you, and thank you for making that distinction between recognizing DPRK as a state and having diplomatic relations. Appreciate it. Ramon, would you like to speak to this as well?
I think Teresa summarized very well. So maybe the only thing to add is that in more recent years, France, the issue that it raises is that North Korea is undermining the non-proliferation regime, and that from a French perspective, this is the reason, or the main reason. There are other reasons, and this could be debated, but at least officially, this would be the main reason why in recent years, China, I was going to say China, I don't know why, France, because it's a permanent of the UN Security Council, right? So France, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, says, well, we shouldn't recognize or have diplomatic relations with a country that is undermining the non-proliferation regime. That goes against our long-standing position, that goes against the regime, and that goes against what France should be doing as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So that's the more recent French position.
Thank you. I would like to share this question raised by Siegfried Hecker in the chat. He asked, what do you think of Kim's outreach to Putin on the May 9th Victory Day, expressing solidarity with Russia in the struggle between progressives, they call them Russia and DPRK, they say they're the progressives, against the reactionary United States. So please, maybe Teresa first.
Yes, well, I don't think it's a big surprise that North Korea will be supporting Russia in the current international situation. To some extent, it doesn't change anything for the DPRK, and it can just kind of benefit in a sense if Russia is no longer gonna uphold the sanctions which against DPRK, which are also upheld by Russia, then North Korea can possibly benefit from some bigger trade. But at the same time, I think in general the lessons from what's happening in Ukraine for North Korea is that actually, our North Korean policy to keep nuclear weapons or to develop nuclear weapons is a good one, because if you give it up, you can be attacked even by those who are supposed to protect you. So in that case, I think it's kind of logical that North Korea would be supporting Russia, and I would be more surprised if it didn't, basically.
Thank you. Ramon?
I find this an interesting question, and I mean, together with a colleague, we were actually writing an article on this topic, right? So North Korea, Russia, China post Ukraine. I think it's coming out in the autumn, if I remember correctly. And what we found very interesting is that there have been many expressions of solidarity from North Korea with Russia. So not only this one, but over the weeks, really, since the invasion started. And we have also seen a rapprochement between North Korea and China. And we have also seen, what might be very interesting, is that Russia very openly discussing the discussions that it is having with North Korea at that time, of course, when no one is able to engage with North Korea properly because of the closing of the borders. And I think that in my view, probably there are a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, of course, that for North Korea, it's crucial to have the support of Russia, China as well, especially if it actually proceeds with a nuclear test, but even with ICBM tests, so that you don't have any EU sanctions being imposed. And I think now this is safe, right? But even if North Korea conducts a nuclear test, as many people think is going to happen in the coming days, obviously there are not going to be more UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea that will block Russia. So there's this important component. But I also think that, I mean, there were these reports, we all remember a few weeks ago, that North Korea was tentatively reopening its border, at the very least the border with China, and there could be trade. And I think that North Korea, at this point in time, if it can receive economic support, food transfers, energy transfers, oil, for example, from from Russia coming into North Korea, this obviously would be tremendously helpful, especially for an economy that has been essentially been closed down for a couple of years. And that, from what we know, even from reports from, you may recall, from European diplomats who were living in 2020, when it actually closed its borders, they were already saying how there were food shortages, for example, in markets in Pyongyang, so never mind the provinces. So I would imagine that any support that North Korea can get would be welcome, especially now when I think it's quite clear that Russia has no incentive to comply with the sanctions regime on North Korea because of the sanctions it is receiving from the US, from the European Union, from European countries and beyond, right? Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore, for example. So North Korea can expect, I would assume, not only diplomatic support from Russia, but also this economic support that it will definitely welcome, especially if at some point in time reopens the border again. That would be an ideal situation from North Korea to receive this support from Russia straight away.
Thank you. Another question from the audience, this time from Professor Chintakanand. He asks, does the panel feel that it is more constructive for Western countries to engage in diplomatic talks gradually, working up to better understanding with North Korea to obtain improved relations? Do threats and sanctions and counter threats really achieve better relations? The professor appreciates her evaluation. Maybe this time, Teresa.
Right. Well, I mean, if we basically think what the goals of the current policies are, that would be, of course, denuclearization. It's improvement of economic situation in North Korea, and it's also improvement of human rights situation. And if we think, I mean, have these goals have been met over the years? Well, we have to say no. So to some extent, you know, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and doesn't bring results, you should maybe start thinking whether, you know, what you are doing is actually the right way to go. So even from that perspective, I would just say it would be worth to rethink the strategy which Europe has, which in general is not a bad one. So to combining, you know, as Ramon described at the beginning, carrots and sticks, but now since at least 2017, if not before, you know, it's been leaning much more heavily on one side. So yes, I would say you should rethink this strategy, and then you can also try to think a bit more creatively. So, you know, I think me, Ramon, but also other European colleagues have been suggesting different steps that the EU could do in terms of at least building, you know, confidence building with North Korea, such as, for instance, restarting the political or human rights dialogue, creating a position of maybe a special envoy for the Korean Peninsula. Possibly once the borders reopen and the diplomats will be able to go back, not just to have a run of, you know, of all the member states rushing to go back, but to actually come as a whole, as a EU, and have perhaps one EU ambassador in in DPRK, which actually we didn't discuss yet, but I would say 99% of the countries around the world, EU has its own embassy, which is called EU delegation, which is led by an EU ambassador. And North Korea is an exception. So there is no EU embassy, there's no EU ambassador, even before COVID. So that, for instance, would be one thing which could be done. So I would say, yes, for engagement and also for creative thinking, trying to do new things and not just kind of repeat the same policies which have been done and which haven't actually brought what the goals of these policies are.
Thank you. Ramon?
Yeah, my answer would be yes. I think most Europeans would say that engagement is good, is positive, right? For several reasons. I mean, to begin with, you actually gather information directly from North Korea, and in my experience, sometimes you get interesting insights, right? I mean, I do remember a meeting after the 6th nuclear test and 2nd ICBM test, so late 2017, we were discussing fire and fury and all these things, right? And meeting a delegation from North Korea, and you could clearly see they were very clear. Please tell the US that we want to talk to them, right? So you're like, okay, well, that's a message that can be passed to the US, right? So at the very least, you get this information from the North Koreans about the direction of travel, right, that they want to take. And you say, well, for others to take it on, for policymakers to take it on, right? So I do think that engagement is positive. Not only this, I mean, there are studies that show that when there are talks with North Korea, they refrain from missile tests and from nuclear tests. So at the very least, there is more stability on the Korean Peninsula. I'm sure if you're a South Korean, you prefer North Korea not to conduct nuclear tests and missile tests in the US and some other countries such as Japan. For example, so there's this positive. Plus, being honest, what is the alternative? I mean, I know that those who prefer the sanctions approach, they give the reasons and they say we'll have to punish the North Korean regime. I mean, and understand this approach, but at the very least, even if you're engaging in sanctions, North Korea is not the only country under sanctions, and other countries that are under sanctions are actually having a dialogue with them. I mean, even now in Europe, we're talking about how to deal with Russia after hopefully the war with Ukraine finishes, right? So we're talking about an actual war, a country being invaded, right, by another country. We're thinking, well, we're going to have to engage with Russia, whether we like it or not, once the war is over. So it would be, in my view, the same should apply for North Korea. There are many other examples, of course. We have like Iran, that also a country heavily sanctioned. We do have an engagement process with Iran. So I understand very well why North Korea should be an exception compared to all these other countries that I think Teresa mentioned this earlier, right? Are engaging in similar behavior to North Korea, really. So I do believe in that engagement is positive, regardless of whether you think that sanctions are still being imposed or not. And I think there's another aspect to this, which is that if North Korea at any point is going to change, is going to be based in engagement, and something that we have discussed in Europe very often, right, is that if we look at the Cold War period in Europe, there was still a degree of engagement, including between the two Germanys, actually, right? At the political level, at the civil society level, there were different levels in which there was engagement process. And many Europeans, including many Western Europeans, they would argue that this is what led to a change driven by civil society in Central Eastern Europe, right? The people of the country saying, well, we want something different. Whether you believe this is true or not, you could argue that the engagement certainly helped to show, if not to the regimes, at the very least to the people in other countries that, look, we are willing to have a different relationship with you. And I think that would be a very powerful message if there was an engagement process with the North Korean regime, but also with obviously North Korean population that can actually take place at many different levels. For example, educational exchanges. North Koreans in the past were actually able to come to European universities. It's not possible anymore for most of them, almost all of them, because of the sanctions regime. And you could argue there was no harm in having a North Korean official learning about the Western economic model, for example, right? There's no harm in that. But you could argue this is actually positive, right? We know, of course, of exchanges that have taken place in Singapore, Southeast Asia, many different countries across the world, who actually see the benefits of engaging with the regime, certainly, but also with civil society as a way to potentially drive change. And that's the positive that I see in engagement with North Korea, or the many positives that I see from engagement with North Korea.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our time, but so I'm going to lump some questions together for you to answer, just to make sure that you have a chance to share your views. They both speak to what roles are handled by the European Union and which are handled by EU member countries. So the first question is, has the EU acted to expel North Korean overseas workers from the EU, or has that been solely up to member states? And the second is, what are the current EU or EU member country funded projects that are operational in the DPRK, or perhaps more recently before COVID? And are they all humanitarian? Who are the donor countries for these projects? So first to Teresa, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions. Well, in terms of the projects, as far as I know, unfortunately, at the moment they are not running because basically you don't have a staff on the ground because all the international workers left. But I think EU, or especially European Commission, is ready to restart these programs. So I think the moment the borders will be open, possibly COVID outbreak will be, tackled, then I think that there is possibility to restart these things. Although of course you always have to, have preparatory work first. I think I mentioned it at the beginning that it's actually the EU, or European Commission, which has the largest portfolio, the largest donor in terms of countries. Afterwards, I think it's Sweden and Germany, and then other countries. But also, for instance, my home country, Czech Republic, has been over the years giving some humanitarian aid to the DPRK, and as Ramon also mentioned, there have been educational exchanges with Pyongyang, both in Prague but also Berlin, which is where I work now. So there's definitely an opportunity to come back to it. And maybe one area I would mention, which we haven't discussed yet, and that's the climate change, because apart from all the crises we've already discussed and we have around, this is the big crisis which we face, and that's actually one area where I think engaging with North Korean diplomats would be worthwhile. There has also been European NGOs which have been working on smaller environmental projects within the country. So, for instance, that's also another area where we could have some European Korean collaboration, and obviously that would help not just Korea but the globe as such.
Thank you, and then thank you, April Jang, for the question. Ramon, would you like to speak to these two questions as well?
Yes, on the one about expelling North Korean workers, that has to be done by member states. It cannot be done by the European Union. It is true that the European Union asked member states to comply with the sanctions regime and to expel North Korean workers, but this is the prerogative of the member states. So the European Union doesn't have the resources, right, human resources, right, or the rights actually to go to a member state and say, okay, here we are going to expel these workers from our country. So that was at the member state level. And when it comes to the projects, what Teresa said, I mean, you may recall when we wrote the report on Korea Matters for Europe, Europe Matters for Korea, we actually mapped out all the organizations, European organizations that were operating in the country, in North Korea, and we had France, Ireland, Germany, Austria, and the European Commission with different projects in the country. As Teresa said, they all had to leave because of the pandemic, but it is true that if North Korea reopens the borders, I'm pretty sure that many of these organizations will try to go back. They certainly have the interest, there's the funding available, Many of them have been operating for many years in North Korea, so they have long-standing relationships with North Korean stakeholders at the local government level, regional government level, also central government level. So they are keen to go back if possible.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of our time. So first, I want to thank our colleagues, the National Committee on North Korea, Keith, Esther, and Marissa, for this collaboration. And thank you to my colleagues at the East-West Center, Sarah and Kimry, for helping prepare the material for this wonderful series. And thank you to the audience for joining, and a special thank you to Dr. Teresa Nabotna and Dr. Ramon Pacheco-Pardo for kicking off this series and for your rich and wonderful insights. Really appreciate it. And I encourage all our listeners to please stay tuned for future installments of this series. Please look at the North Korea in the World website for information on North Korea's relations with the international community. And please look to the NCNK and EWC websites for future programs. So with that, again, thank you very much. Have a good day.